This is Contemporary British Society, and today we are on class number 4, and the topic theism. And here are 3 questions which we are going to try and address in the course of today's class. Number 1, how many people in the UK consider themselves to be religious? So we'll basically consider the degree to which, or society within the United Kingdom can be considered to be religious, and what kind of metrics we might use in order to measure that. The main religious denominations in the United Kingdom. And third question especially, which is interesting, and that is the relationship between the church and the state in the UK, which is rather different. Before we get into that, I thought we might start with this headline here. This is from The Guardian, and I've the story. The headline, as we can see, it feels like people want to fight. How communal unrest flared in Leicester. Leicester is part of the Midlands in England, not that far from Birmingham, one of England's biggest cities. And here we can see a rather sort of typical looking British high street with a lady in a headscarf pulling a I'm not entirely sure what the word for that is. But anyway, she's taking her shopping. And below that it says, for decades, Muslim and Hindu communities have lived side by side in East Leicester as friends, colleagues and business parties, but unease among residents has been growing for months. So this story concerns about sort of intercommunal tensions in Leicester, particularly between the city's Muslim community and the Hindu. Obviously, on the subcontinent, relations between these two religious groups have never been easy. But as the first paragraph in the story below there indicates, until recently at least, this was in most UK cities. However, for the last few months, I should say this story was in September, so it's not very, very recent, but basically this has been a sort of ongoing problem in Leicester for the last few months in 2022. And again, having read through the story, there's various reasons various factors sort of contributing to this problem, not least social media seems to be responsible for a lot of problems that many societies are experiencing today. And the only reason why I sort of started with this, because first of all, as I say, it's sort of topical, but also it sort of reminds us that Britain is a multi-ethnic society, but it's also a multi-faith society, which again is obviously Christian, and not just overwhelmingly Christian, but overwhelmingly Catholic, so one denomination of spiritual life addition from other faiths. In Britain, as I say, and Leicester, as I say, it's like a number of cities in the UK, especially in England, it has a town, which means that its citizens worship folks, and say the Muslim in this story. So we will sort of consider the various sort of faiths in Britain. The other thing to note, though, is that Britain itself is usually described as being these days a fairly secular society. So religious practice among, I would say, probably a majority, maybe even a significant majority of British citizens is not a big part these days. And this sort of headline alludes to this. says here, less than half of Britons expected to tick Christian in UK census. The census was last year, and the census is taken. This is obviously in the sentence, in the census, and that gives the government a sense of sort of included on the census, including their religious affiliation. It says, snapshot of Britain will see many reject church as immoral or irrelevant, academics predict. One thing I should have done, and maybe I'll take a look now in a moment, is to see what was this slide last year. So presumably look in a moment and update the slide. But the trend from previous censuses is that fewer and fewer British people were declaring themselves to be religious or practicing or not practicing any particular religion. And in the census, there's usually several boxes you can tick describing what religion you are: Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, etc., etc. But there's also a box for no religions in recent years. And probably a majority of Britons these days would, again, something. Certainly a big contrast with another well-known English-speaking country, the United States, where religion plays a much, much stronger role than it does in the UK. So as I said, British secularism in Britain is quite days. Okay, I had a quick check, and it seems as though the results have yet to be published, so we don't search be released. They're probably going to be released next year. So we don't. So we're still having to rely on the statistics from the previous census, which was over 10 years ago now. No, as I said, the sort of general trend over the last few decades is clear, and it's a downward trend. So as I said, the number of people, religious group, religious denomination, that has sort of steadily. So the expectation belong to one religion or another. A similar chart here from YouGov, which is opinion poll. Some graphs here. Are British people religious? And the question people were asked in one of these surveys is, I apologise, I don't have a date here, but it was from a couple of years ago. And according to this, 37% said yes, belonging to a Christian denomination, yes, a non-Christian denomination, that's the sort of light blue, and that's about 6%, no, 50%, according to this sort of sign. There's no indication here in terms of the sample size or things like that, but again, it's sort of in line with the previous headlines. About roughly 50% saying, 7%. Not sure, don't know, prefer not to say, right? I'm not quite sure why you would answer not sure to that question. And then how religious, if at all, would you say you are? Not very, not at all religious, 77, so a much higher figure there, so intensity of religious feeling. So obviously among that 37%, yes, Christian, and the 6%. Some of them might say, well, I sort of identify as being a Christian. Perhaps I was baptized in church, funerals, maybe turn up at Christmas or Easter, things like that. But apart from that, not very sort of engaged. So there's obviously a sort of difference between religion as being part of your identity, how you think of yourself. So 77% say either not at all religious or not very religious. Less than a quarter. And another chart there. This time slightly different. Okay, this is from 2011, so presumably from the previous census. And in this chart, 59% of British people declaring themselves to be Christian, but again, as I said, who just identify themselves in that particular way, as well as religious observance slightly more seriously. About a quarter saying no religion, 5% Muslim, 4% other, and 7%. Get a sense of these results. National life. And another story from The Guardian. Again, this is from a few years ago now, but essentially sort of echoing some of the statistics that we've just seen, more than half and survey. But it also makes the point, as you can see in the survey shows generation gap on religious affiliation is widening, with only 3% of adults under 24 describing themselves as Anglican. And that, I think, is something that is sort of fairly well documented. Insofar as people are still going to English churches, and we'll talk in a moment what exactly we mean by Anglican in a moment. But insofar as people are going to churches in England, parts of the UK as well, of course, for the most part they tend to be, as I say, in the Anglican Church. As I say, they are sort of literally, some of them at least are literally. Okay, here we have a quotation from the British Council. There, if it still works, so I took it from a few years ago. But the website says the UK's official religion is Christianity, and churches of all denominations can be found throughout the UK, such as the main other religions are Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Judaism, religion, and there are various denominations within the, again, as we've already noticed. So there are and books of this class. And another quotation, this time taken from the website of the Office of National Statistics, which incidentally is a good website if you want sort of those statistics on different aspects of British life. Some of them are sort of published freely, others are sort of more. As I said, the website often does contain some quite useful data. And again, sort of noting the 2011 results of the census, and it says there were 4 million fewer Christians in England and UK, 5% of the population, so again, similar to the pie chart we saw a moment ago. However, the number of people identifying as Christian has declined since 2001, when there were around 37 million Christians representing 7. But that's interesting. So, quite a marked decline. And as I say, the expectation when the results are finally published is that the 2021 census will identify a further decline, with possibly less than half. As I say, quite a significant and quite a sharp sort of identifying themselves. And again, we can talk. And another quotation there, Office of National Statistics, still the second largest group were Muslims. Okay, so aside from the various sort of Christian denominations, the next biggest population to 2.7 million themselves as Christian has sort of declined quite steeply. So all the other groups are sort of increasing, albeit from fairly, as you can see here, from fairly small percentages, 8%. Beliefs as well. Also sort of increase small. But it sort of does illustrate the way, if you like, that sort of British society, and as I say, that's something that quite a lot of comment. So let's start with the sort of dominant religious faith, and that is Christianity. And let's start with the established church in the United Kingdom, which can be referred to as, I suppose, the Anglican community, the Anglican Communion, I should say, or simply the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church basically is the Church of England, the Church of Ireland. Okay. And look at the headline here: Church and State is the. You can see here. This is a photograph from the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Obviously, in a few months' time, King Charles III will participate in a similar ritual, and this is literally the sort of the king, which, as you can see from the picture, is usually with quite a lot of. Although, just to make a passing reference, seeing as we're on this topic, there's some debate at the moment as to exactly how ornate problems at the moment. So there are people judicious for the government to spend vast sums on the coronation. So we'll see coronation proceeds next year. Anyway, going back to this photograph, so as I said, this is 1950 coronation ceremony. Is obviously, and it is the Archbishop of Canterbury who is this ritual, among other things that, and it is all for some of these years or so. But what the photograph demonstrates is that the Anglican Church is very much state. So unlike in many countries, such as France or the United States of America, there is no separation of church and state in the UK system. In fact, the church in many ways is an integral institution. And of course, while the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think I might have said something slightly misleading, head of the church, it is the English monarch who is the head of the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury is sort of administering the church within the church. But as I say, officially, obviously, head of state and is at the apex, if you like, of the British Constitution. So as I say, the church itself, and it's the fact. So thinking about Christianity in the UK, first of all, Britain has been a Christian country for a long, long time. I say Britain, but the geographical entity, let's say, that is today's the British Isles. Christianity has had a presence on these isles for a long time. As I said, Christianity, this is the first point on the slide there. Christianity reached the Isles almost 2,000 years ago. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as his name suggests, is based in Canterbury. The major sort of cathedral in the UK is based there, and the reason for that is that the first Christian church was established in Kent, in that rest of the Isles. And as we noted, today Britain is considered to be a Christian, is Britain's religion. But again, as it is today, a largely secular society, consider themselves to be particularly religious. And again, statistics are slightly teen. About 13% of the population was thought to attend some kind of weekly service. So the Christian services, but might include synagogues and as well. And again, as we noted, some other these communities. Quotation from our textbook, and it says there, it seems that religion still remains a factor in British life, whether as active adherence to specific denominations, in normal identification with specific faith groups, in personal beliefs, practicing belief in Wales, Scotland. There's some point of class in Northern Ireland, which is quite a distinct. But yeah, I think the point where he says, although many British people don't consider themselves to be religious, in some ways religion does still, which is something to be aware of. So yes, Britain is a fairly sort of secular society these days, but to say banished from British life. Okay, another slide here, which is on the history I should say, on the slide here. So, but yes, as the first point on the slide shows, Christianity basically arrives with the Romans. Or I should say, well, actually, the Romans converts to Christianity. But when it does, and when Christianity, it sort of fairly quickly sort of permeates in Isles. Second point, unclear how deeply entrenched it becomes with the Romans. It's not really until the 6th and 7th centuries that sort of structure begins to form an establishment, let's say, in this route for Synod of Whitby. Synod, Catholic worship and practice is accepted. So this is Synod. And of course, Britain, again, so I'm being slightly misleading, the British Isles, and especially Christian, but along with the rest of Europe, they're also Catholic, which is all the way up until when this guy arrives on the scene in the 16th century, and it is under experiences of the Reformation. And in some ways, actually, Britain's Reformation is somewhat different to other parts of. You can still see the structured and the way it performs its services. So 1529, Henry VIII argued that he should have a supreme legal authority, and a few years later, the English Church finally sort of makes the break from Rome. And as I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the story, the primary reason for that is that he wanted a divorce, so the church split. So he was able, I should say, to marry Anne Boleyn, who came to quite an unpleasant end. The interesting thing, though, is that although Henry sort of decides to split for political, personal reasons, in many ways he was still sort of committed to the Catholic form of service. So the English Church, in terms of the way that it was structured and then the way that its sort of services were performed, remained actually largely Catholic. And that's a sort of oddity of the church in many ways. It's not the service in terms of the way it is structured. We sometimes talk about Episcopalian, meaning that it has bishops, like church. After Henry dies, there's something of a struggle in the decades after between those. There were several English monarchs who either secretly or not so secret to this sort of Catholic faith. Others were more resolutely Protestant, notably Queen Elizabeth I, very much sort of strengthened the position of the crown, but also to sort of root out Catholicism. And so, the church sort of breaks from Rome. As I say, the sort of structure is not that different from Catholicism, but there are some changes, though, which are quite significant. Not least, the services were formed in the vernacular, as we say, the vernacular basically meaning in the English. The Bible was translated, and the reason I sort of include this photograph, and William Tyndale was the first English, so the monument there commemorates him. The other reason why I've included this in a village just below the hill here, it's in Gloucestershire. So as I say, my son up to the top of it this summer. Anyway, so that's the main reason why I stuck this into the slideshow. And then in later centuries, Protestantism itself actually becomes divided. And there's a split, to some extent, there's a sort of split within the Anglican Church itself between what is sometimes described as High Church in the Anglican Church, in which the actual buildings of the church and the services are as I say, not dissimilar, and the Low Church, which is more Protestant, if you like, more, similar to the sort of Europe. There are also dissenters who sort of come, and they are sort of Protestants who were dissatisfied with other denominations. And they come to be referred to as non-conformists, so not conforming to the Anglican Church. And there are some things, including, as I said, there the Methodists and the Baptists. Civil War also sort of reflects the sort of religious divide in Britain in the 17th century. It's sort of high church, let's say, and it's more resolutely Protestant. And as I said, even after Restoration, restrictions are sort of placed on minority faiths, especially Catholics, but also dissenters. And it's not until the 19th century that Catholics participate more fully, let's say, in national life. And a photograph here, this is of Gloucester Cathedral, again, cathedral I know quite well. And you might have actually seen, because some of the scenes from the Harry Potter movies, so some of the scenes which were purportedly in Hogwarts, were actually filmed inside Gloucester Cathedral, in the cloisters and places like that. And Gloucester Cathedral is quite impressive. Again, I was there this summer. I took my son for history there, including at least one English king who is buried inside Gloucester Cathedral. This was Edward II, who came to a pretty gruesome end. You can Wikipedia that if you're if you're interested. Gloucester Cathedral, not dissimilar to a number of big sort of city cathedrals. So quite built, in different stages over the centuries and modified. This is what it's. So as I say, most historic English towns, English cities, I should say, of some sort. Gloucester, as I say, quite impressive. Salisbury is another. King Charles, he'll be crowned in Westminster at the century, so just, I think it was conquest. So yeah, these churches are pretty old. Another example of an English church, St Martin's Church, North Nibley, Gloucestershire. Again, the same village as the Tyndale Monument, and the same, a good part of my childhood in. And again, a fairly sort of English church there, with a belfry. A belfry is where the bells are housed, which ring out for service on Sundays and religious occasions. Stained glass window we can also see there. So again, fairly sort of. Sometimes some churches have what are known as steeples. So yeah, as I say, English churches pretty old, but as we noted at the beginning, a lot of them, and it's often the case that vicars is basically priest. Many vicars these days actually have several churches, which there are vicars and not enough congregations having a single vicar these days. Okay, the Church of England. Then, as I said, this is the established church, and as we've already noted, it's sort of part of the British state itself. Bishop of Canterbury, speaking in the House of Lords. And again, going back to the point I made, that there isn't a separation of church and state, UK, or at least not in England, I should say. Slightly different in Scotland and Wales, I should say. And one of the ways that sort of manifests itself is that bishops are allowed to sit, so they have the right to sit in the House of Lords. So again, this is a British of the British state. So as we've already noted, the monarch is church, so King Charles III. Theoretically, bishops, I say theoretically because these days it's actually the decision as to who. So the monarch these days sort of rubber stamps, if I can put it that way, their decision. So officially the monarch will still appoint it's these decisions. It's not publicly funded, so funds, but it's generally not that short of money. The Archbishop of Canterbury leads the church, as we noted. And we've also noted the division between the High Church and the Low Church. So as I say, the High Church, sort of fairly Catholic, its services. The Low Church, Protestant, in its services, so not dissimilar. And a few more statistics there. In 2014, weekly attendance. I think I took the weekly attendance estimated to be about 800,000. Wales is not a huge amount. This is important though. Women also allowed to serve in the church since 1994. So there are women vicars. There's at least one, probably more, women bishops. And that has been controversial. When this was introduced, they were quite to this, and some converted to Catholicism. The other thing meant that it sort of strengthened the division between, if you like, the sort of Anglican Church and the Catholic Church. So in the early 1980s, there was some sort of discussion as to whether there could be some kind of reconciliation between the two churches, but the introduction of women priests. Divisions exist within the wider Anglican community. So yeah, it should be noted that when we talk about the Anglican Church, yes, we're talking especially in places which were once part of it, is that the church in the UK tends to on various issues, including things like homosexuality and stuff like that. Outside the aisles, the Anglican Church is often comes to social issues. So there are definitely sort of divisions within the church. And I suppose one of the differences between the Anglican Church and in the Catholic Church, the Pope has sort of absolute authority. So, if the Pope makes a decision, it basically becomes the Church's policy. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who sort of runs the church, has nothing like the same sort of power so he can sort of guide and influence the way the church deals with various issues, but he can't issue a decision. In fact, often happens is that synods, things like bishops across the world come together and they try and debate these issues. But as I say, his decisions on the church. So in that sense, it's more democratic church, disputes and arguments in church. Much of his membership drawn from the middle and upper classes, and there used to be a joke that conservative, and yeah, the landed aristocracy and people like that were very much. Again, this is less so the case these days in British politics as well. The other thing to note, though, is that sometimes there's been quite a significant clash between the church, in the case recent, the sort of economic conditions that Britain is facing, and assistance and things like that. So it's not always individual bishops anyway, political disputes with. Just a couple of other things to note. Church of Scotland, separate from the Church of England, not least in terms of the way that it conducts its services. Church of Scotland sort of born out of the more sort of dissenting aspects of Protestantism, so much more of a sort of Protestant church, so closer, as I say, closer to places like that. Church of Wales also disestablished and not part of the state. So there are sort of variations relationship with the state. Aside from the Anglican Church, you've then got the Catholic Church, which is, if you like, the sort of second most popular Christian denomination. And these days, the Catholic Church receives a fuller various reasons for that, not least, though, immigration into Britain. So a lot of Catholics have sort of come from parts of Europe, not least Poland, of course, and they're sort of swelling up church attendance. So again, as church attendance in Anglican churches has sort of declined, the opposite is true in increasing in terms of their attendance. And then you've got the other churches as well, as I said, the non-conformist churches like the Methodists, the Baptists. They also play a role in British life. The Baptists, particularly strong in parts of Wales, but in other parts of the UK, and then there are sort of even smaller denominations and sects. And then you've got the very sort of small, Oakland describes as sort of enthusiastic Christians, so theological views, let's say less mainstream. So as I say, a variety of different, somewhat ironically, 600 years or so after, slightly less than that, isn't it? But several centuries since the Reformation, Catholicism, if you like, it sort of seems to be British life losing ground. Thinking about some of the other non-Christian religions in the UK, there's a fairly big Jewish community in Britain. And Jews first appeared in conquest in the 11th century. At one point, they were actually banished the Jews, but the present community, as it says there, sort of mid-17th century or so. That said, Jewish community has sort of declined in recent years, so unlike other religion, and perhaps a more disturbing, another disturbing phenomenon, let's say, is that anti-Semitism. A problem in British life, and more of a problem. Again, this is not something that's unique to Britain. You're seeing it in other parts of Europe. I mentioned about growing tensions between the Hindu and Muslim communities in Leicester. Social media almost this sort of disturbing phenomenon. And as we mentioned earlier, the second largest faith group in the UK is the Muslim community. It's about 2.8 Muslims in the 2011 census. There's probably a few more than that now. And the third point there, mentioning that most live in England in a few towns and cities, particularly in southern England. Obviously, London has a large Muslim community. We mentioned Leicester earlier. There's a few other towns, as I say, mainly in the south. Not only, but mainly in the south. All the cities, I should say, the bigger English cities. To take one example, Gloucester as well. There's a large mosque. As I say, most bigger cities in England, a Muslim community living within them. Religious observance is relatively high, especially in observance in the Christian churches, especially the Anglican Church. And the Central Mosque in London is the largest Islamic institution in the West. Other groups: Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists. I haven't actually put on the slide here, but of course there is a Buddhist community as well, and of course Hindu community, very much reflected in the fact that the new British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is a Hindu. So that itself is almost a sort of reflection of Britain's sort of multi-faith society, but also, I suppose, the fact that minority communities in the UK are playing a greater role in British national life. So it's quite interesting. Obviously, Rishi Sunak is the first sort of non-white and non-Christian Prime Minister of the UK. So very much an expression of the fact that Britain is a multi-ethnic society. And the point again, we mentioned this: non-Christian religions are growing, but 40% of the population is nominally Christian. As I say, nominally in the sense that people identify themselves as being Christian, even if they don't regularly worship at the local church. 4 non-Christian groups can vocally express their views on certain issues. They might be issues of the UK, and so one example there was Muslim opposition to Britain's participation in the 2003 Iraq War, which actually cost Britain's Labour Party quite severely, because generally speaking, it comes to attracting voters from minority ethnic groups, but a lot of Muslims turned their backs on Labour. Blair's overt support for President George Bush's war on terror. Occasionally, issues outside the UK can sort of intrude on these communities. So again, I mean, going back to the beginning headline and the tension between the communities in Leicester, the Muslim and Hindu communities in Leicester. To some extent, we mentioned social media, but also the fact that the governments in India and Pakistan outline so things that are happening in countries which these communities have quite close ties to can also sort of intrude in their everyday relations with each other. There's the issue of cooperation among the various religious groups in the UK, and yes, it's notable that there are sort of various multi-faith councils. Often the British government can sort of organise sort of meetings with religious leaders and gets the chief rabbi, senior figures from the Muslim community and the primate, etc., all around the table. A couple of other examples there. Example of World Council of Churches, designed to promote ecumenicalism, the various Christian churches together, the Council of Christians and Jews. And as we mentioned earlier, Anglican and Catholic churches were also unity. For a time, as I said, in the 1980s, it seemed that reconciliation or unification even between the two churches, but the issue of women priests probably more or less made that impossible. Internal conflicts within faiths as well can sometimes sort of threaten cooperation. One area we haven't really touched upon, which is quite significant, we will probably have a separate class discuss more detail at some point. But in Northern Ireland is basically divided into two quite distinct communities, Catholics and Protestants, and that feeds into that part of the UK's politics, with most Catholics broadly support should be united, and most Protestants broadly supporting unionist parties, so those parties which actually support. So that's one part of the UK where obviously religion plays people's sort of spiritual views, but also encroaches, if you like, on everyday life and especially relations between the two communities. So in that sense, Northern Ireland is quite. The rest of certainly don't really sort of spill over into the political sphere. We've also mentioned the Anglican Church itself can sometimes be quite divided between the more sort of conservative wing, and as I said, many of them, that wing having a significant presence in parts of the developing world, outside the UK and in North America as well, for that matter, and which other senior figures in the church have adopted, and that too goes to and other faiths as well. And then there's the issue of religious education in schools, and as the first point makes clear, RE is compulsory. Religious education is compulsory in English and Welsh schools. One other point we should make is that a lot of English schools and Welsh schools are associated with the Anglican Church. They used to be administered directly by the Church. These days they are sort of state. They are state schools, but they still maintain links with the Church. And we'll talk more about that when we get on to discussing the British education system at a later date. But yeah, by law, religious education has to be taught in English schools. Also, it is said it is required that they should start the day with an act. Obviously, the actual nature of that worship would sort of depend on the particular community that the school is located in. Religious lessons should be mainly, or again, that depends on the school. Obviously, if the school is located in a district, let's say in London or another city, which is predominantly Muslim, the lessons will reflect that. But in towns, villages, in cities, the school population is nominally anyway Christian. Then yes. Although that said, multiculturalism and things like that, other faiths are taught in British schools as well. As I say there, in practice, how much religion in school. And in recent years, governments have sought to promote faith-based schools as well. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister between 1997 and 2007, was especially keen on these types of schools. And I think Conservative governments since then have also this idea. There's a sense in Conservative quarters that schools with which religious association, traditional discipline, pupils and things like that. So is Britain still a Christian country? And that, I suppose, depends on how you define the particular question. Is somebody a Christian? As we noted, church attendance and Christian religions themselves as being Christian. But the one point I made earlier is that, first of all, there's a sort of whether or not you are a practicing Christian church, participating in some kind of act of worship on a regular basis, or whether you sort of identify yourself as being Christian. So even if you don't regularly go to church, you're Christian, or feel that you have some sort of link with the Christian church. I think that's especially true with a lot of Catholics, people who might not necessarily go to church that often, but who still themselves as being Catholic. Even when defined in those terms, though, it's still pretty clear that there has been a decline. Then we got the issue about the role of the church in British life, and especially its role within the state. And as we noted, the monarch is head of the church's system, bishops sit in the House of Lords, etc. So in that sense, in an institutional sense, Britain is still a Christian country, in the sense that the church is actually woven into the fabric of British life. Even if a large part of the population no longer identifies themselves as being Christian, the church still nonetheless has. You do see it as well on major occasions. So obviously, with the death of the Queen recently, commemorations and funeral and things like that. As we noted at the beginning, King Charles will have his coronation in a few months' time, and again it will be the Archbishop of Canterbury performing the service and crowning the king. So in various ways, in that sense, in the sort of political as well as the sort of wider cultural sense, Christianity clearly does still have a sort of presence in British. A significant percentage of the population don't. The other thing to note that is that we've seen that attending church still in some way consider themselves to be Christian or a believer or things like that. So church attendance is only a very sort of rough guide to people's sort of religious affiliation, individual beliefs in that sense. But having said that, progressively more secular. I mean, just thinking about the reasons Part of it, I suppose, is just sort of modernisation to this sort of values. A lot of it, though, is sort of rooted in scandals in the church as well, which, the Church of England, like the Catholic Church, has not been entirely sort of immune from various scandals which have come to light, which has sort of led people to have less confidence in the church. People just busier, perhaps, in terms of that. So possibly a variety of factors, but there's definitely been a sort of, as I say, a sort of progressive secular statistic, how people respond to censuses and things like that. And I think in this slide we more or less made most of the points I just mentioned. So as I say, lack of church attendance doesn't necessarily reflect a lack of spiritual. Not going to church doesn't mean that they don't believe in some sort of higher power of some description. There's also alternative belief structures as well. So things like Druidism and New Age thinking and things like that. So a lot of people would say, yes, we are, consider themselves to be spiritual in some way, but then might not be sort of practicing conventional religions. Third point, polls suggesting that Britons are more individualistic in their beliefs. So again, that's that in some ways is a. But next point, religious issues often discussed in the media. So just taking a look at there's a section in Britain, not just Christianity, but different ethnic groups. As we mentioned earlier, religious leaders can play a prominent role in national debates as well. So the bishops sometimes popping up and commenting on issues which they think, which they consider to be important or have some issues attached to them. Margaret Thatcher was very close to the chief rabbi when she was prime minister, or spiritual council as well. And despite the sort of decline in religious sentiment in Britain, moral traditionalism is still prominent among many Britons. And there's a general sense, a lot of divorce rates and things like that. So even if especially religious anymore, but you do get a sense that is quite important. I would say that most although Brits today are most socially liberal, are more socially liberal. So Q issues, etc., and the various sort of religious, the various religious denominations have to sometimes really have to sort of grapple with that or reflect that. So as I said, parts of the Church of England on these issues over the year, because to some degree they have to sort of society. And again, I think I've more or less covered this, but UK social structure sort of based on Christian religion. So we've kind of mentioned things like schools and stuff like that. The family unit as well, you could say more generally, based on these ideas. But there's some debate as to exactly how Christian a lot of these values are. Does it make sense to view them as Christian values or just sort of? But the third point there, as we said earlier, the church still, despite declining attendance, and the Anglicans are still quite influential figures within Jews. And the final slide here, which is basically based on the podcast, which might be worth listening to. So I've included on the slide there with a few questions. Usually I play this in class, but have a listen to it. And it's basically discussing England and the title about the last rites for the Church of England. The last rites in English, that's the religious ritual that a priest before somebody dies. So essentially saying, and 3 questions: who groups of worshippers, and what sort of evidence is there? As part of the 6 minutes of the podcast, these questions are addressed. So it might be worth, as I said, exercise for you in terms of practicing your listening skills. So as I said, there's a link there. Obviously, this is optional, but you can do this at home. As I say, if we were doing the class live, I might. Okay, thank you. I will leave it